and masculinism. And there's a whole theory. You could already, from what we've talked about in Dodson Grey, get some idea of what she might be talking about. Because one of the feminist critiques about technology is that it's not concerned with cooperation with the environment, that it's based on an assumption that growth is always good, that unlimited growth is a good thing, and so you can get some idea of what she's talking about. For those of you at home, I was just talking about a talk on today that some of you may be interested in. Professor Geraldine Finn, I believe she teaches at Hull in Quebec, will be talking in the Education Department, room 120 of Dalhousie University today from 4 to 6. And she's going to be talking about feminism and masculinism and technology. And she is a fairly well-known feminist in Canadian studies. And she's written a number of interesting articles, so some of you may want to attend. It's not the greatest weather for it, but I think it may be well worth your trip out in the snow. Okay. Today I'm going to finish talking about patriarchy as conceptual trap, to the relief of you and me both maybe. We've been talking about this for a long time. As I was saying to the class before we were on the air, I've spent a fair amount of time talking about Dodson Grey because this is going to be a major topic on your midterm exam. And so this is the time to get anything straight that you're confused about. And those of you at home who have the phone number, if you have some problems, please call us today while we're on the air, or call me during my office hours. I'll be in my office most of the day today, and you can ask me any questions you have about the text. Okay. Anybody got any burning issues as of the moment before I start again? About Gray's book? Or about anything else that you have any concerns about? No? Yes?
Is there any word when women in politics and culture are going to come in to the...
I know. I think we better just accept that the reserved readings in the library are what we've got. And I will try to, like I've been doing, photocopying some stuff and handing it out and sending it out to people at home to make up for that. I know it's a real pain to have to sit in the library to read the stuff. There's not a lot we can do about it because we learned after the term started that they weren't going to send the text. And the last we heard from the publisher, they don't even know where the textbook is at the moment. They've shipped all the books from one distributor to another distributor, and they haven't got any idea where the texts are. Great, huh? So I think you might as well accept the fact that you're going to have to read the required reading from the text from the reserve desk in the library. And I think now there's about 6 copies in there. There were 4 for a while, but now there's 6. So there shouldn't be much of a problem in getting a hold of them. There should be always at least 1 copy there, even if people are reading at the same time. Any other questions? Okay. Well, we left off talking about Darwin and how Darwin's theory might be sexist. We were talking about all the different ways theory and language can be sexist. And Grey gave her model of the hierarchical model that religion tells us, with God at the top, and then man, and then child, and then animals and plants and the rest of the environment. And she stated, I think rightly, that when you transfer to most scientific accounts of the evolution of human beings, you don't get a very different story. I mean, God gets removed, and that not always. I mean, there are Christian evolutionists. But to a large extent, God gets removed, and that disturbs a lot of theologians. But other than that change, the hierarchy stands pretty much as it is, with man as the pinnacle of evolution, and man being the male, not being a generic, woman beneath him. And there's some really classic phrases in a lot of evolutionary texts saying things like, woman is somewhere between child and man in development. I mean, there's no doubt about it that woman is considered not to be quite as evolved, and that her traits are different and diminished reflections of male traits. Okay. Now, the problem of which Darwin was aware, and this is part of the problem in this kind of story, and the story of evolution is a story of ascendancy, and it's told in a hierarchical way. And this problem with ascendancy is that difference or uniqueness doesn't necessarily mean better. And Darwin knew that, but he slipped a lot himself. He identified that problem explicitly a number of times. That when I say, you know, I'm paraphrasing what Darwin might have said, if I say that man is the most highly evolved species of the species, I'm not saying that he's somehow better, but just that he's different. Now, although Darwin knew that, he slipped a lot in his own language. And people who have been less cautious than Darwin slip even more. And there were a number of people who, in the 19th century, took Darwin's theory not only to be a justification of the superiority of man, but also a justification of the superiority of some races over others, and took white Anglo-Saxon man to be the most highly developed and morally superior being on Earth. Now, that isn't what Darwin meant, although we have indications that sometimes he thought that. When you read what he said about the Irish, it seems quite clear that he thought they were lower on the phylogenetic scale than the Brits. So he had some funny ways of talking about people that even though he indicated this isn't what he meant, he slipped. And he certainly slipped when he talked about women. And Dodson Grey calls this confusing uniqueness with superiority. Now, if we look at what happened to Darwin's theory at the hands of people like Herbert Spencer, now Herbert Spencer was a theorist at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and if you look in a more vulgar form, in what was said by Rockefeller loved Darwin's theory of evolution, and I'll tell you why later, because he thought it justified his owning a lot of money and property. You can see how dangerous it can be to the confusion between uniqueness and superiority. What happened, what Spencer did with Darwin's theory of evolution is adapt it to the marketplace. Now, Darwin says basically, and I'm not quite sure if I told you this last day, so I'll just repeat it basically. Darwin's theory of natural selection has a number of assumptions. It assumes that well, one thing, he accepted this belief from a man named Thomas Malthus, that the species on Earth multiply faster than the produce on Earth can grow to supply the species with food, right? People and animals breed faster. He believed that all creatures were super fertile, right? So they bred faster and in more numbers than there could be produce to support them. Now, as a consequence of this, he said, there's a scarcity for the natural resources necessary for survival, right? And as a consequence of that, he said, there is a struggle for existence. So he saw the world like a battleground where different species and different members of species were struggling to exist with limited resources. Now, even that is an analogy for the way the world is, should make you pause. There's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of just accepting that the world is not a particularly nice place in evolutionary theories, in many evolutionary theories. And in fact, some feminists have argued that this is a particular worldview and we shouldn't necessarily accept it. And that what follows from that is also thinking that human beings are territorial, and what follows from that is thinking that war is natural. So there's a lot of assumptions built into this that you should think about when you're hearing what Darwin had to say. So he said that there wasn't enough food around for all the species. Consequently, there was a struggle for existence. And another thing he said was there are natural variations in the population, and some are more adaptive than others. So natural variations, you know, every so many hundreds of thousands of births, I don't know the statistics, but there's children are born with 6 fingers, right? Now, what Darwin would argue is if you lived in an environment where 6 fingers made it easier for you to get food, you would be able to eat, consequently to survive, and you'd survive long enough to reproduce, whereas somebody with only 5 fingers might not. You know, there are a lot of random variations. Sometimes people are born with 1 blue eye and 1 brown eye. If that happened to have a peculiar adaptive trait, Darwin argued, then those people would have an edge, as it were, in surviving long enough to reproduce. Consequently, their children, their progeny, who carry the genetic trait for one blue eye and one brown eye, would reproduce, and that trait would be carried on in the species, whereas those with only 5 fingers, say it was a 6-fingered person, the 5-fingered people would die out over time. Yeah.
But was he only concerned with the physical variations? Like, did he ever touch on, say, the mental variations that occurred?
Well, seemingly he did when he talked about things like tools, use of tools or techniques for hunting, because it obviously had to be an evolved intelligence that thinks it might be easier to kill something if you have a weapon than if you're just trying to beat it to death with your hands, right? So there is that, but again, he attributed, if you mean, why wouldn't women get in there, or are you just wondering? Okay, well, he tended to give those attributes to males, the discovery of things and the illustration of intelligence and discovery, he attributed to males. And he attributed to males because his assumption was that what was required for survival was aggressive kinds of shows of intelligence. So those who could do battle better, those who could kill animals better, would have an edge or an advantage, and consequently they would last around long enough to leave progeny, and so the biggest and most intelligent males would survive and pass their genes on to future generations. So he did account for intelligence, but that's the way he counted. Okay, I think that's enough of the Darwin story. Does everyone understand that basic description of how things evolve? Okay, now what happened when people, and I'm telling you the story to tell you how dangerous, remember we were talking about the difference in confusing uniqueness with superiority. So that's the basic story of evolution. Now Herbert Spencer thought it was a great model to apply, and it's a natural one to apply, it fits quite nicely, with capitalism, the marketplace. And he looked at the marketplace and he said, well, why are some people really poor and why are some people really rich? And guess what he said? Bet you can guess. Well, he used the same images. It's a vicious world out there in the marketplace. There's a struggle to market your product. There's a struggle because everybody's trying to do it. So there's a struggle, and only the fittest survive. Right? There's a struggle for existence in the marketplace, and only the most fit survive. Survival of the fittest. Now, if you transfer Darwin's theory to the marketplace, what is problematic about that? What follows from believing that the most fit are the wealthiest?
Because they would be the more aggressive. Have a lot, the male traits, the predominant aggressiveness.
Yeah. It's a real problem in how you treat, though, how you would order your society. I mean, that's true, but what would you think how would you order your society if you accepted this as a belief? Well, what would you do with the poor? You sure wouldn't have a welfare system. Because for one thing, you feel totally justified in those people dying out because they're not fit to survive. It does a couple things. It justifies incredible wealth when there's incredible poverty, and it also justifies not feeling any obligation to give poor people any money. It also justifies not helping disabled people, because you have a justification that if I'm John D. Rockefeller, I should be John D. Rockefeller because I am superior. I am the fittest, and that's why I've made all this money, and I don't have to feel sorry about those who are unfit. So if they die out, if they starve to death, if they happen to be disabled, that's their problem. They should die out because they aren't fit. So you can see the very dangerous thing that happens when you confuse uniqueness with superiority. And in fact, that's what happened to Darwin's theory. in the 20s, it was really, really acceptable to use an evolutionary model to look at the economic situation in the United States and in most Western industrial countries. And if you read Rockefeller, he loved to give sermons in churches on Sunday, and you can read long tracts where he says all this stuff about how happy he is to be so fit, and he talks about that the man felt totally justified in having his wealth because he thought that it was the natural order of things that he should be so rich. Okay, now to return to Darwin, it's clear that human beings are unique creatures. What is not so clear is that those unique features give human beings the right to dominate all other life forms on Earth, and especially male human beings. That is no more clear than that man's, and here I mean males, strongly physical structure gives them the right to beat or rape women. It is not a justification. And further, Dodson Grey argues that these false assumptions about man's natural dominion over all other life forms have resulted in our disruption of the ecosystem. Now, you may remember that you may not remember, probably a lot of you are too young, during the 70s, there was a lot of talk about the fact that we lived on what was it called? The spaceship Earth. And it was when people really started to see the damage we were doing, when it was very, very clear Lake Erie at that point was considered dead. And many of our Great Lakes were contaminated and still are, such that it's highly dangerous to eat anything the few fish that are alive. It's very dangerous to our systems to eat those fish. And in Toronto, they were doing studies that found that there were high levels of PCBs in mother's milk. And it seemed that the PCBs, these people weren't doing anything peculiar, they just were eating the vegetables that were grown and sold in markets. So a lot of people started talking about the spaceship Earth, and what they were trying to say is that we are enclosed, and this is the notion of the ecosystem. We live in this kind of enclosed environment, and everything we do, just like we lived in a spaceship, has an impact on our environment. And if we don't believe that, if we don't think of ourselves, and if you'll recall from Patriarchy's conceptual trap, she pictures the world as a fetus in a womb with the placenta, with the umbilical cord attaching the baby to the mother's system. And so if a mother smokes and drinks, it has a direct impact on the growth and health of that baby. Similarly, if we pollute our environment, it has a direct impact on our environment. And we're going to destroy the ecosystem such that some species, and eventually we are among those species, will not be able to survive. And conservative estimates are that right now, 60% of all cancers are environmentally produced. We have already messed our environment up to such an extent that we put ourselves in imminent danger of getting cancer from our environment. Okay, Gray wants to argue that all of this follows from a false ideology that man has dominion over nature and can use nature in any way that he chooses. And the impact of that, she says, is the world that we live in now. A world that in one picture she illustrates, she has some illustration of a rotting tomato and a father saying to his son, someday none of this will be yours, because we've turned our world significantly into a garbage dump. And she wants to relate that kind of notion, whether we take a religious view or the evolutionary model, of man as dominant and in a position of power to use the things in his environment, including other creatures, that the world we have now is a direct consequence of that. Okay. As Gray puts it, we have the illusion that we somehow must manage the earth because we think God has given us dominion over it. And even if we haven't done it right today, we're still convinced that tomorrow we'll do it perfectly. We seem able to go on thinking this despite mounting evidence that we don't think holistically enough to anticipate all the multiple unforeseen effects of everything we do. I mean, we really would have to be God, or we'd have to be far more intelligent than we are to understand the impact. We make discoveries, and we act on those discoveries before we see what the range effects of those discoveries are. And we saw a classic example of what happens with science and technology 2 days ago, when that spaceship, that shuttle mission, for years they've been doing that they've had 25 shuttle missions, and they thought they had it all down pat, to the extent they were so secure that they'd started putting civilians on the shuttles, and we saw what happened. Okay, now Grey argues that what she's asking people to do is to finish the Copernican revolution. Now you recall I talked about how Galileo had to deny his knowledge that the Earth revolved around the sun, because the religious beliefs at the time argued that the Earth had to be the center of the universe. Now the Copernican revolution, the revolution that marked the general acceptance of the Earth's place in the solar system, according to Grey, is just the first step in our recognition of our proper place in the universe. So she said that was an initial step. We realized we weren't the center of the universe, and man was not the pinnacle of that central universe, of that center. She states, having got our astronomy straight, we left the rest of our mental pyramid of value and being in place in our heads. So she says what she's trying to do in her critique of conceptual traps is set us up to want to continue that Copernican revolution, to humble ourselves, to see that we're part of the natural order of things, we're not the rulers over the natural order of things. She said, first we thought that man was the center of the universe. And again, remember, when I use man, I'm not talking about generics, I'm talking about males. She said, then we accepted that there was a solar system and we were just a part of it. Now we have to continue that, because we still have in our heads that same imagery, and it's an imagery which is destroying the world. The problem with this is that hierarchical thinking, she argues, not only ranks diversity, but it also legitimates the oppression of people in nature. Okay? She says, and that's the problem between uniqueness and superiority, too. She says, when you rank order things like that, you're not just showing that this is different than that, you end up saying this is better than that. And the consequence of that is you oppress other people, that you put lower on the scale. She argues that if we look at the Holocaust, we find the argument that Jews, and homosexuals, by the way, were inferior was a grounds for their extermination. If we look at the oppressions of blacks in slavery, we find that the argument that they were inferior to whites as justification for the behavior. We have a history of so-called diversity and then oppressing people. And you see it currently in how we think about males and females as diverse. Again, I've said before, we could think about the similarities between males and women, males and females, that we're all rational, that we all use language, that we all have the same amount of limbs, generally speaking, or if we don't, we suffer from the same disabilities. But we don't do that. We are bimodal, we have 2 eyes, we have 2 ears. We communicate the same way, but we don't think about that. We have a history of ideas that thinks about the diversity between the sexes, and then the next thing it does is say, and females are not only different, they're inferior. Now, if you look at what happened with the oppression of blacks in the United States, you find both of the arguments she's talked about when she talked about religion and she talked about science. Religious ministers at the time that there was slavery in the United States argued that there were religious grounds for knowing that whites were superior to whites were superior to blacks. In fact, they argued that there was reference in the Old Testament that, the fight between Cain and Abel, that the mark of Cain that was placed on Cain during that fight was to turn him black and to make him inferior. And that was the justification for slavery in the United States. You also found scientists trying to show that, so you had that religious hierarchy that she mentions. You also had a scientific hierarchy at the time. There were a lot of people measuring the sizes of brains at this time and into the late 19th century. And what they did was they took skulls of whites and women and blacks, and they used to put shell, what's it called? Gunshot, that little stuff that's like BB gunshot. These pellets, yeah. They'd take all these skulls and they'd see how many of these little pellets you could fit in every skull. And they decided on the basis of that who was as intelligent or more evolved than the other. And what the interesting thing is, when you look at the research that people did at that time, well, they had to change it when they found out that brain size didn't have a direct relationship to intelligence, but that's another problem. It was interesting to see, we talked about how expectancy or belief system can sort of help us see the world in one way and not see it in another. A number of the so-called eminent scientists working in measuring brains at the time always observed black brains were smaller than white brains. Now, when people tried to replicate their data, they didn't. Oh, and they found North American Indian brains to be smaller. When people tried to replicate their data, they thought, what could have been going on? Why did these people find confirmation when it's just not confirmed? And what they did is, where there was evidence, where the skulls were still around, they looked at the skulls. And what had been done was uncharacteristically large brains had been chosen, skulls had been chosen from white people, and uncharacteristically small from Indians. So they chose very small-statured people, who, of course, had smaller heads because they were just smaller. And, and then compared the two and said that it was quite obvious that since blacks had small brains or Indians had small brains, they were intellectually inferior and less evolved. So it really shows you the dangerous ways our value system, what we want to believe, can influence what we do believe. And this kind of research still goes on. One of the most recent attempts to prove that blacks were inferior was carried on by, again, a so-called eminent scholar in the United States during the 70s. And his name is Jensen. And we know that, but although these statistics are changing over time as blacks get more education in the United States. But for years, there was a big gap between black performance on intelligence tests and white performance in the United States on intelligence tests. And Jensen wanted to figure out why this was the case, and because it becomes quite clear what his value system is, he came up with a biological determinist account. He said they were genetically inferior, blacks in the United States. And he told a very unusual story. He said that, he hypothesized that only inferior blacks would have been captured in the first place as slaves, that the really bright blacks would have run away. So he said you start out with an inferior gene pool. You had inferior blacks to begin with, and then you brought them over as slaves to the United States, and they all inbred. I mean, one really gets the man's values coming out loud and clear, and this stuff was published in the 70s. Yeah.
That's the 1970s.
Oh, yes. yes, we're not talking about anyway, he concluded that the inferior gene pool, that it was genetically determined that they would perform in the inferior way because this was a genetically inferior pool. Now that tells you the dangerous natures of these kind of stories and what can be done with. I mean, he had no problem, there was no problem with the fact that he found that, this is the problem between, again, remember what we're talking about, the difference between uniqueness and superiority, or diversity and superiority. There's nothing particularly wrong with observing that blacks perform differently on IQ tests than whites. The problem comes in what you think that data means. And if you think they're genetically inferior, then the next step might be, so of course we won't give them the same education, and of course we won't put them in the same positions. Now, if you think that socialization and your environment has an impact on the development of intelligence, then what you will do is look at the environment of blacks in the United States and of whites in the United States and see if they need some extra help, what was called in the States an enriched environment. And in fact, luckily, more people believe that than believe Jensen. So for a number of years, there was an enrichment program that allowed kids from poor backgrounds to start preschool and get some kind of extra stimulation. But it shows you which side you come down on, what you think data means, has a significant impact on what you're going to do. Okay, to return to Grey, she argues that diversity is not honored in a hierarchical society. Rather, it is judged in terms of who has the most power, the most education, the most money, etc. And I'm sure being in a university, which operates in a very hierarchical manner, all universities do, you should be able to understand that in terms of what happens to you when you hand in things to be graded. I mean, we order universities in terms of performance levels. And those performance levels have an impact on what you're going to be able to do when you get out in the world. And we value those people who perform best in universities, and we give them higher marks, and that influences the choices they can make for the rest of their lives. I mean, when you think about it, that is what you're doing. I mean, if you give people low marks and they want to go to law school, they're not going to go to law school. If you give people poor marks and they want to go to graduate studies, they're not going to go to graduate studies. The impact of the grades people are given in a university, it's all judged on terms of how one performs in a hierarchical way. And the impact of getting good grades versus getting bad grades will significantly alter your choices for a long period of time in your life. It will screen out that either you can become a professional and earn more money, or you won't be able to. So it's when you think about hierarchy in terms of what's happening in your own lives, I think you can see what it does. And I was thinking about this when I was writing this stuff down. I remember the thing that drove me probably most nutso when I was a student was, you'd hand a paper in, especially if you cared about the topic. You'd worked on it for a long time. It had become important to you. And it was difficult enough that somebody was going to slap a grade down. That was going to say, it was worth this. But even harder than that for me was walking out of the class and invariably having somebody go, what'd you get, what'd you get, what'd you get, what'd you get? How'd you do, how'd you do, how'd you do? Because immediately people wanted to put everything you put into that thing in a hierarchy of, was yours more valuable than mine, or was mine more valuable than yours in terms of what one person decided it was worth. So I think that kind of thing can show you the destructive nature of hierarchy.
Why do we continue with that structure in a university that has somewhat feminist, or at least it sees itself in a feminist setting?
Yeah.
I find it very curious that it is so hierarchical.
Why does the Mount give out the grades like every other university?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a very...
I can give you a very fast and easy answer. I mean, one of the fast and most justifiable answers is that if we did not, then our students would not be considered as the same as students from any other university in the world.
Yeah.
So they would be oppressed anyway. I mean, if Mount St. Vincent didn't grade the way every other university did, then you still wouldn't get into the law schools or the graduate programs or get the same jobs, because everybody else would say, well, Mount St. Vincent, they have no standards. That would be the approach, because we live in a hierarchical world. I think the Mount tries to do other things to modify that. They try to make the university a more humane and livable kind of educational environment. But if we threw out the grades and said, we're here to teach you values, and which I think a lot of us believe, that we're here to teach you knowledge and values, and the mission statement of this university is that we not only want to teach you information, but we also want to make you more moral and reflective people. I think most of us are committed to that, but we also feel that we have an obligation to make the rest of the world recognize what we give you in here. And if we got rid of the grades, they would just say that's the women's university and it has funny standards, and those are non-transferable grades and non-transferable degrees.
I recognize that problem. I think what I see is I find the structure, I'm a duet student, usually watching at home, and I find the division, first of all, just the setup of the camera placed on you. I don't have any contact with the students in this room.
Yeah.
I find it's very hierarchical. Behind there.
Yeah.
It's very difficult I haven't been able to pick up the phone. It's very difficult to ask questions in the situation.
I think that's really important to know. I think we do recognize that. The one thing, and I think this is an indication of the university's commitment to women's studies, is that one of the reasons we have distance university education, as problematic as that is, because one is isolating the home, there are a lot of women who can't take any education any other way, who can't get an education because of children, because of being out in a rural area where they have no access to public transportation. For all those reasons, the amount is at least trying to reach people. And I realize how isolating it is, and it's difficult to pick up a phone, and we try to work with those problems. But I think the very fact that we have Duet is our recognition that we want to communicate with people outside the
I don't
classroom.
question that. I think that's true. I think what we're doing is we're only going halfway, though, because
Sure.
the technology, you know, what I see, and, you know, no offense to the camera person, but I see that, you know, perhaps there has to be a different structure to this room. You have to be more a part of this
Sure.
group.
Well, you know,
for
I mean,
to
it
be-
definitely influences the teacher too. I tend not to lecture that much when I don't have a camera on me, because it's not
Exactly.
particularly interesting to watch at home if I'm not giving information. I mean, it's more, or maybe that's a
No,
maybe
that's
mistake
a
on my part.
fallacy, because the other day there was some technical problems with ASN for the film,
Yeah.
First part of the film, but after the film was over and you were more casually placed, you were up front here.
Yeah.
I felt a more direct contact between the class and you, and consequently I could partake of that.
Okay.
Okay? I was glad to see you start in front and you
Okay.
went behind so quickly.
Yeah.
You know?
All right. Well, that's a good. See, we can modify. That's probably my shyness too. I mean, I wasn't
Yeah.
trained to teach on television.
I understand
I'm
that.
used to the dynamics of classroom, so I've been probably hiding back there. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I don't want to be, I don't feel that the criticism I'm giving is I
think
mean
that's
for it to be
important.
positive.
I think that's important, and I think one of the things that I appreciate about you talking like this is that one of the things that I find that I miss most is the interchange, because I usually have probably one of the noisiest classes anyone in a university ever has. I usually can't get through all my material because my students won't shut up. And the lack of response I find very difficult.
Yeah,
as a
and I
teacher.
think it is the structure, because basically, you know, we do have our textbooks, and we can, if we want to read them, I don't feel it's necessary for you to necessarily spell out everything in the textbooks for us. I would rather more exchange, because when I learn from exchange, so knowing
Yeah.
what you're thinking, but also knowing what anybody else is thinking in the classroom.
Okay, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll ask, you know, if other people feel this way, we could make, because I do feel an obligation to go through some of this material, especially like when I start talking about the Baker article. That is very difficult stuff. I mean, that's really endocrinology. This isn't an endocrinology course, so I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. But it's difficult stuff, and I do know from teaching this stuff before that if you don't spell it out, you find out on tests that people do not understand it. They really give you very garbled stuff. But maybe what we could do is have a more informal part of this where I talk maybe for an hour and we talk for a half an hour. Now that puts a lot more burden on the students in the class, and I think this has to be sort of a democratic thing. For one thing, you have to have read your material or you won't have anything to say. I mean, one of the things that's disturbed me about talking so much up here is that there's no obligation for you, because you know I'm not going to corner you, to read the material. And of course you're going to get a lot more out of it if you've read it before you come into class. So other people may not feel quite the way that you do about the exchange, but we'll discuss that. I mean, I don't know how other people feel or whether they want to say anything about that.
Certainly notice the difference in the class.
Yeah.
You know, that it is more structured,
Yeah, yeah,
and I think there's more hesitancy.
yeah.
And that's ironic when it's a women's studies course.
That's right.
That's what I find, is that,
Yeah.
that as women, we should be attempting to make some changes. You know, albeit
Sure.
we're fitting into a bigger structure of the world. We can't change everything even if we'd like to. But, you know, I always feel cheated too when you take the break.
Yeah.
And when you come back, I know that you've been chatting away
Well,
with
you know what
everybody.
happens when you
And we
won't
missed
even
all that.
know
We
this.
get the satellite dish. you
What
know?
generally
Music.
What generally happens is that everybody starts talking,
I know.
and what happens at the end of class is a bunch of people come up and talk to me, and that's been driving me crazy because I keep thinking, why didn't you say that half an hour ago? Why did you say that after the cameras were turned on? Because people often say very interesting things after the cameras
I
are.
feel that, and I feel like I've missed all the good
Yeah.
parts.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, despite that, don't feel like I know you're just going to hear the music at home, but I have to take a 5-minute break. Yeah. Thanks very much. I really appreciate that. I think that, and I mean, I think I have been constrained by